Hello everybody, I'm Michel Lussault. I'm geographer, professor of urban studies in University of Lyon in France, and I'm very happy to be with you tonight for this amazing Nuit des Idées. My research is focused on the issue of planetary urbanization, and I would start by remind a very important point. Indeed, it should be remembered that we have just experienced a particularly intense sequence of planetary urbanization. This sequence has been characterized by the empire of a dominant social imagination that took hold from the 1980s onwards, that of the world city. A world city is an urban organization that is certainly situated in a local area, but which is above all globalized and set up as a platform for functional optimization in the service of economic growth, maximization of the interest of financial investments, and speculative valuation of the land and real estate market. This imagination is instituting, to use the words of the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, l'imagination instituante. It is globalized, it drives urban strategy in every country, it brings together a particularly effective body of ideologies and technologies which shapes contemporary reality. It is an indication of the power of the global urbanization process, of the planetary urbanization process, which began in its most active phase after 1950, accelerating since 1990, and probably accelerating again after 2010. Such urban prevalence shapes our common way of life as urbanites in the global world. It has increased recently because of what the most recent phase of capitalism has promoted. This has led to upheavals in urban landscapes that have no equivalent in history, with, for example, the construction everywhere of impressive skylines and the multiplication of what I called in one of my recent books hyperplaces, hyperlieux, that are in a sense tagging globalization, such as shopping malls, ports and airports, transportation hubs, spectacular equipments for culture and sports designed by star architects, recreation parks, etc., etc. The world city imaginary is based on few principles, including the very first one, that of ever more. It assumes the absolute need of unlimited growth of everything and anything. Economic growth, valued in terms of GDP, growth in material production, growth in the circulation of data, individuals, and objects, growth in consumption, growth in tourism, but also horizontal and vertical growth of available urban and suburban space. Indeed, one has to remind that planetary urbanization is based on the permanent production of more livable space, and the urban economic machine is driven by this process and overvalues it, which explains the real estate speculation and the soaring prices of housing and construction throughout the world. Undoubtedly, the urban global world is a world of evermore. The planetary urbanization world is a world of evermore, and this explains its extractive and emissive characters. Emissive because urban activities and functions directly or indirectly emit greenhouse gases, pollutants, and waste in overabundance, all of which contribute to environmental disruption and to the deterioration of living conditions. Extractive because urban activities and functions require, in order to be fully realized, to consider the slightest biophysical reality, a soil, a mineral, an animal species, a microorganism, a forest, some water, etc., as a deposit, as a kind of mine from which a resource can and must be drawn until it is exhausted. Urbanization, planetary urbanization, constitutes an extractivist system, an amazing one, a very powerful one. Everything must be exploited without any real consideration of the impacts. It is easy to understand that contemporary urbanization as an emissive and extractive system is the major vector of global change, which we know is affecting the biophysical functioning of the Earth and, as a result, is threatening the human habitability of a home planet. We, as human beings, are discovering that we have already entered the Anthropocene period, which is in the process of redistributing the game. And the Anthropocene could even be considered as an urbanocene, in the sense that global change is fueled by planetary urbanization. However, can we not think that at least three phenomena should push us to radically criticize this pattern of urbanization of ever more based on power and on competition? First of all, the banking and financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic have shown us to what extent the planetary urbanized system, which is presented to us as an incomparable edifice of power, is in fact very vulnerable and very likely to suffer systemic damages. Second point, the multiplication of environmental alerts, catastrophes, and disasters linked to global change should incite us to question the functioning of this emissive and extractive urban system, whose impacts on the Earth are becoming increasingly clear to the point of making us aware of a possible crisis of planetary habitability for human beings and for non-human agencies. Third point, and finally, there is also a growing awareness of the accumulation of wealth by the super-rich people, the thin minority of super-rich people, whose standard of living seems to be characterized by ever-increasing wealth and a kind of arrogant disregard for the conditions of living of other inhabitants. This also feeds the feeling of declassification of many middle classes inhabitants and fuels a discussion, an interesting discussion, on the need to rethink the distribution of wealth in a sense of greater justice. Then we could argue that the forces of the planetary urbanization system, of the global urbanized system, all forces are weak. And that is therefore important to find other ways to ensure a human and urban habitation of the Earth that will be at the same time sustainable at the plane of the Earth system, just at the plane of the social and economic organization, and ethical at the plane of the finalities of the actions of the human beings. How then can we ensure a good life and an emancipating one for all? This question does not seem abstract and unrealistic to me. On the contrary, it seems to be the most important one. And the answer seems quite clear to me. Nothing can be done without profoundly questioning the instituting imagination of ever more, of power, of performance, of competition, of the systematic private appropriation of resources. We have to question the instituting imagination of the world city. This is how I am trying today to elaborate an approach of what could be what I call the spatial care, spatial with an A. That is to say, a set of principles allowing to take care of our spaces of life in common and of our cohabitations between humans and between humans and non-human entities, agencies. I elaborate this by drawing inspiration from the seminal work of the philosopher John Tronto. I don't have the time here to detail this approach, but I can say that it is in every way different from the dominant imagination mentioned previously, the dominant imagination of more mentioned previously, where we have the habit to systematically value more of wealth, of resource extraction, of energy, of objects in circulation, etc., etc. We must oppose a new policy of less. We must oppose the lessness that is accompanied by promotion of other types of more. Let me give you some example. Less privatized wealth and more sharing resources. Less expensive and wasteful performances and more robustness. Less spectacular design and architecture and more comfort of use for inhabitants. Less overabundance of building materials and more recycling and reuse. Less competition and more solidarity and interdependence. Less exploitation of ecosystems by agro-industry and more agroecology that is both nourishing and restoring the biodiversity of the living. Less private property and more cooperatives. Less confiscation of resources essential to life and more commons. Less authoritarianism, it's difficult to say in English, and more democracy. Less top-down urban projects and more involvement of inhabitants. Less patriarchy and more feminism. Less dependence on technology and more creativity. Less global entertainment and more diversified cultures. Less digital networks and more public conversations and writings. Less Western imperialism and more decolonial approaches, etc., etc. What a program! It will probably seem a little bit unrealistic. But my research shows that many experiments already exist and show encouraging perspectives. And then, I prefer the somewhat naive idealism that consists in affirming that a better individual and collective life can exist is possible by making sobriety a general ethical principle, than the utilitarian cynism that has been elevated to a cardinal value since 1990. Thank you for your attention and have a good night.